Welcome and good to see you again, Dr. Lord.
Thank you, Randall. Thanks. It's good to be here.
Hmm.
Yeah, because I had started getting into mysticism and occult philosophy and questions about consciousness in high school, really. And I
Hmm.
was trying to have spiritual experience that I had read about that people had on psychedelics, and and then I started to have those experiences, like so many people, and it left me with more questions than answers, like all good experiences do. And
Hmm.
really, when I took your class, that was when it really helped me organize my thoughts around all of these kind of occult philosophy, mysticism kind of topics that I had been into. Yeah, I'd been exposed to a lot of it, but going through your class and having it kind of organized in my mind, and especially like drawing the sacred geometry, and just when you kind of see that structure that's just built into reality, it kind of changes, it kind of reorients
Hmm.
your whole brain. It kind of changes you. And I definitely owe those lessons to you from getting to take that. I
Well,
felt really lucky to do that.
thank you for that. Thank you for that. I mean, it's gratifying to hear that, and I certainly agree that, yeah, by studying the this particular system of geometry, which is like a grand unification of form and proportion, dimension. It covers what most people don't realize, but if you do, of course, I think, is that when we talk sacred geometry in its integrally as an entire system, it includes both space and time, because when we understand time as cyclical, then we can move from cyclicity to frequency, and from frequency we can now move into the realm of geometry.
Right.
So anyways, yes, and I also, of course, from much earlier than you, went through the same thing. High school is where it started for me with those questions, particularly my senior year. But I had my junior year, I for some reason got obsessed with science fiction, and then over the summer, I moved and I shifted, and then I began to have the actual experiences of the psychedelics, which were available back then in 1968. And that completely altered my perspective. And it sort of was fortuitous in a way that I had spent this year immersed in science fiction, because by getting into the science fiction stories, that really does something to you cognitively while you're trying to imagine what it is that's being described through words and on paper and so forth. And I'm sure you have some insight into how, you were mentioning doing the drawings. Well, obviously, if you're doing those drawings, there's going to be a correlation of activity in your brain, right? And if you're writing, it's going to be the same way. Now, if you're writing, does that activate a different part of your brain than drawing? I don't know. Or is it part of the same functionality of the brain?
I would think there's a little bit of overlap and also a little bit of separation.
Uh-huh. That makes sense. So okay, so you had these experiences, and as with me, I mean, it immediately opened up this world of questions I had. Like,
Yeah.
okay, nobody ever told me that there were other realities, and that those realities perhaps were even more real than the reality of the five senses that we're so immersed in. Did you find yourself kind of with those same kinds of insights? And
Yeah, and I started to have experiences of these kind of hidden powers of the mind, whether it's things like lucid dreaming or precognition or other kinds of, call it, psychic abilities. I started
Mhm.
to have, and also just synchronicity, the power of a real good synchronicity to just rock your world if you are in that kind of materialist view of things. um,
Yeah. So have you had any interesting anecdotes as far as synchronous experiences in your life that left a lasting impression? I could say I've had three or four maybe
Hmm.
that I thought were really the synchronicity was quite startling.
Hmm.
Can I tell a very short
Yeah.
one that I think a lot of people might relate to? I was on one of my tours with some of my buddies. We were doing recon tours. This is before we were doing like public tours. Out with and you, who knows? Maybe you were on that tour. I don't. Well, you weren't on that, but I think we should mention that you've been on several of these tours that we've been out, and maybe we talk about that a little later or in another episode. But yeah, were you on two or three of the tours? We're out
I
exploring.
think too.
You were in the two. So you were on the recon tour. So, anyways, we were on this recon tour. There's about four or five of us guys. We're driving in the van, and I had brought some music, and I said, a couple of the young guys were not that familiar with the Allman Brothers. And I said, listen, man, we need to correct that deficiency in your life. I just so happen to have the two-disc set of Allman Brothers live at Fillmore. I got to play it for you. So this is like whenever, well, we can get the date exactly. You'll understand why in a minute. I popped it in. It's four sides. You know, it was the original double album. One of my all-time favorite albums was two full albums. All right, and it's all live. I think both Fillmore West and Fillmore East. Anyway, so we go through. We listen to the entire two sides while we're driving up into. I think we're on a Southwest recon. So we're driving up there amongst the mesas and all that, listening to this music. The final song plays on side two. It stops. I go pop it out of the slot there, and it defaults back to the radio that was playing, and the news was on, and they were just releasing the news that had come out that Greg Allman had just died. So that kind of like blew me away, freaked me away. You know, Greg Allman, of course, he was one of the original
Right.
Allman
Right.
Brothers.
Wow.
So that's a recent synchronicity that I still impresses me when I think about it.
Hmm.
I mean, literally, when when the album stopped playing, the news comes back on, and the newsman is talking about, well, Greg Allman has just died, and I saw them live several times. You know, had their albums. They were like one of my all-time favorite bands, and so when I heard that, it kind of affected me in a way because of the synchronicity, but also the fact that I had been a longtime fan. I knew that Greg was ill, probably going to die soon, but all of a sudden there it was, just like so. I mean, I thought, well, my gosh, how synchronous was
Yeah,
that?
you got his last
Um,
jam.
yeah, that's kind of it. Was just still it still kind of gives me goosebumps when I think about it.
Hmm.
Anyhow, so that's my story of synchronicity, and I'm going to turn it back over to you now.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, I yeah, stuff like that, and I also started getting more into kind of the mysticism aspect of it, the inner
Yeah.
experience aspect of it. I did the usual thing where you dabble in different forms of meditation.
Yep.
I dabbled in that. I dabbled in practicing magic, which that'll also really kind of rewrite your expectations of reality
Hmm.
if you put yourself fully into it. And and with like the way that psychedelics works, the way that they kind of bend your perception of reality. It's just always something that has fascinated me so much, and as I really started to grow up, I got really serious about trying to pursue it scientifically, and trying to go at these questions about these types of things in a very serious, rigorous, systematic way. And
Hmm.
partly because that's the only way I could satisfy myself, because the dabbling wasn't enough. It still fascinates me, and so it kind of has gotten me through grad school. I did several interesting things in grad school, which we'll talk about, and then now I'm out the other side with a PhD. Um,
And you in our in our first attempt to talk here, you were mentioning how you connected with the work of Ingo Swann,
Right.
and I had mentioned to you that I had not known much about him until just recently, and uh, my getting an acquaintance, actually becoming friends with Lynn Buchanan, who one of the one of the key players in the whole remote viewing movement and his connection with the Department of Defense and all of that. And he actually, on his ranch in New Mexico, he actually leads now training workshops in remote viewing, but not so much for national security purposes, but for all the other potential things you can do remote viewing that would be valuable for remote viewing. I didn't know much about it. I was a little bit skeptical, but having gotten to know him now and hearing stories right from the source, who was intimately involved in the whole process for years, and having gotten to know Lynn, I have no doubt of his integrity and his credibility. So I fully believe that the things that he's telling me are true and accurate depictions of what actually happened. And so I am now, of course, much more leaning towards, yeah, there is something there that's possible. And where my fantasy always was about it was not knowing really much about it, but just knowing that it existed is you would be able to identify with this since you've been out in the field with me. When we're out there tracking these tremendous events that have shaped the landscape, and we're trying to envision these events now that are long gone. They were things that happened once upon a time, 10,000, 12,000 years ago, whatever, right? We're looking at these events and seeing the end result of this process, but not seeing the process itself. And could remote viewing or some type of enhancement of consciousness possibly open that up where you could get a much clear and distinct impression of what exactly the process and the forces at work, like, to use a metaphor, like what would we have seen if we were hovering in a UFO up above some of the great mega floods that you and I have studied together? What would we have actually seen? Now, is remote viewing in any way? Now, what Lynn told me was that, well, that it perhaps had that potential to break the time barrier, but that they hadn't really explored that realm of it. So he kind of left it open, which I thought was interesting because, boy, what a tool that would be if you could somehow actually, in your consciousness, actually visualize what happened there, that left this landscape that you're looking at.
Well, it came through I got my master's at the University of West Georgia in Carrollton. And that they have a really interesting program there. It's a humanistic psychology program. It's one of the only in the world that does that. And so, among other things, I got to study Jungian psychology, Buddhist psychology, parapsychology, in this rigorous academic setting, which was really awesome. The other thing I did there that was one of the main things I did was I worked in special collections at the library where I was an archivist for Ingo Swann's personal research files.
That was it. Okay, yeah.
And so I spent 2 years working on this. It was, I want to say, over 200 boxes worth of stuff. And I wasn't the only one on it. There were a couple people that kind of passed through the collection. But the part that I got a hold of was kind of the most difficult part and kind of, I felt like the real kind of inner sanctum of it. And it's a weird story because the truck that was transporting the boxes to the library got in a wreck. And so everything got scattered. And
Ooh.
normally when you're an archivist, you want to preserve the collection because even if it's all out of order, that's part of the collection. That's the way the person kept it. This is the messy folder they kept it in. That's part of the story that's being told and that you want to preserve. For this, we had kind of an abnormal situation where we needed to impose a little bit of order on it because everything got scattered to the wind in the truck when it got in the wreck. And all the stuff that got scattered was his, like, all of his writing and his personal notes and some of his like most personal stuff. And I worked on his correspondence and I worked on all of that. And so I had to really go through it in detail and kind of figure out how to kind of piece the puzzle together.
Uh-huh.
And you know, talking about these kind of wild experiences, I definitely felt his presence in there sometimes.
Hmm.
Where, and I don't know if it was just the kind of puff of cigar smoke that I would sometimes get a whiff of as I opened a box, or something else, but you could really kind of feel him palpably um, going through his files like that. And I figure if anyone could do something like that, it would be Ingo, because he was such an accomplished remote viewer, such an accomplished artist and psychic. If anyone could pull it off from the grave, it would be someone like that. It was another one of kind of, call it a larger synchronicity with the way it all happened, because I didn't know any of this was at West Georgia, and then I started I started my program there, and then learned that it was there, and asked for a job, and got it. And then when I first started reading his stuff, I just kind of immediately felt this connection with him, where I felt like I kind of understood what he was trying to do. And he was a prolific writer. He wrote a lot of books that, for whatever reason, never got as popular as I think they should have, because he was a very lucid writer. Um, but one of them was, and this was a manuscript that we found when I was working in there. It was called Psychic Literacy, and this was really kind of a remarkable manuscript where he was essentially trying to map the entire landscape of the potential of human consciousness. And for someone who had done so much work in not just remote viewing, but prophecy and precognition and dreaming, and he kind of touched everything at some point in his life. He was trying to put all of those things together and give this grand overview of what human consciousness is capable of. And so we got that manuscript published. I edited it and put it together, and we published it with his niece, who's in charge of his estate. And and so that, you know, I that work too also really, it was another thing that really kind of changed me, because you can dabble in these things and kind of get impressions of like, whoa, did I just do that? Like, did I just have a psychic experience, or did I just have some sort of precognition or something? And it's one thing for you to kind of sit there with yourself and try to work with it, and try to figure out whether or not you're tricking yourself. But it's different when you start going through this research collection where they have this training program, and you're seeing this like systematic improvement in people as they go through the remote viewing training, and they go from getting like 3 out of 10 to 8 out of 10 hits on the
Mhm.
lessons. And like I saw this stuff like firsthand. I like went through the records and saw that. And so, some of the stories that came out of that are really remarkable. One of my favorites is how they, you know, you're talking about remote viewing far back in time. They did do a little bit of that, and you can see some of this in the CIA reading room. They tried to remote view Mars like a million years ago. Yeah,
Really?
Joe McMoneagle was one of the ones that did that, and it's a trippy document. They remote viewed these beings that explained how they were getting into essentially some sort of stone coffin, and there was some sort of global cataclysm that was happening on the planet. And it was kind of implied that like the planet was getting destroyed, and they needed to go into this like form of hibernation for a very long time.